Thank you, Madam Speaker, members of the House. As many of you know, I am exceedingly proud of my hometown of Norfolk, Virginia, and the prominent role in which our residents have played in the civil rights movement. While I contemplated which story to share with you today, I kept returning to the theme of legacy. In particular, which legacies do we choose to remember, and which do we choose to celebrate? I realized that a titan of that movement, whose place in the history books isn't as prominently displayed, but whose legacy also looms large, is Mrs. Evelyn Thomas Butts. Mrs. Butts was born in Norfolk in 1924, the third of 6 children. Her family lived in Oakwood, which was then a part of Norfolk County. She attended a blacks-only school that had no 12th grade, and she didn't even finish high school. While her husband fought in World War II, she rode the streetcar to the upscale department store Ames and Brownlee to work in the kitchen. It was on those rides that Mrs. Butts witnessed the injustices of a segregated Norfolk, and how cruel this world had truly become to blacks, even as we helped build this country and defend it, just like her husband Charlie was doing at that time. Mrs. Butts became a member of the Oakwood Civic League, helping push for paved roads and connections to sewer lines in that community. Her activism grew in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education, which I'm sure all of you know found public school segregation to be illegal. Mrs. Butts joined the NAACP and took part in efforts around the region to defeat Jim Crow laws. According to her daughter, Mrs. Butts picketed local grocery stores that wouldn't hire blacks for certain higher paying jobs. Mrs. Butts took her daughter to Old Dominion University's Foreman Field to protest against segregated seating at the football games. Mrs. Butts testified in Beckett versus Norfolk School Board, which challenged the city's massive resistance to school integration. While she was there to testify, Mrs. Butts noted that the restrooms in the court building were segregated. And I'd note that we're still unwinding some of the ugly vestiges of segregation and massive resistance even today. By 1963, Mrs. Butts and her attorney, Joseph A. Jordan Jr., who later became the first black member of Norfolk City Council and a judge, filed their first lawsuit against Virginia's poll tax, which at the time was $1.50. That poll tax would now be close to $13 today. Surely none of us can even imagine having to pay to vote nowadays. And although their first case was dismissed, they persisted and filed another one the next year. Jordan was joined in arguing the case by Thurgood Marshall, then the U.S. Solicitor General. Mrs. Butts' case was combined with a similar case out of Northern Virginia and became Harper versus Board of Elections. Ultimately, as you all should know by now, the Supreme Court ruled in Mrs. Butts' favor by a vote of 6-3. After the decision, Mrs. Butts said the victory was an accomplishment not just for poor blacks, but also for poor whites who couldn't afford to pay that tax. But she didn't stop there. Mrs. Butts became active in numerous civic and community and political organizations and received dozens of awards for her service, and she was the first black woman commissioner appointed to Norfolk's Redevelopment and Housing Authority in 1975. Mrs. Butts died in 1993, and the General Assembly's memorial resolution called her one of the most influential political leaders of the last 3 decades. Nearly 30 years on, Mrs. Butts' story isn't widely shared in the history books in our public schools. However, her legacy looms large, especially to me. And while I was researching more about Mrs. Butts, I thought deeply about perseverance. These last several years in Virginia's story have both challenged us and given us cause for hope. Over the last 4 years, I've had my ups and downs in the Assembly, and certainly days, debates, and votes that I'll never forget. Admittedly, there are a few exchanges that I still go back and watch on YouTube because I took those moments to heart. And like most of us, I think we can all agree that we've made our fair share of mistakes during our tenure. Votes that we regret, statements that we've made in committee or on the floor, or conclusions that we jumped to quicker than we should have. I still feel remorse over putting my name on a statement of condemnation before all the facts came to light. I've spent 2 years figuring out how to try to make that right. But even more importantly, I still regret not being more forceful in demanding accountability over deeply offensive hypocrisy that played out in front of all of our eyes. Throwing someone under the bus for personal preservation should never be condoned. We should all also know that silence doesn't mean acceptance of a flimsy excuse or shallow and feigned remorse. And believe me, I still replay this exchange over and over again. Yet as we contemplate our legacies, both individually and collectively as a body, I encourage us all to look to Mrs. Butts' example. She toiled to expand access at the ballot box, to right the wrongs that she experienced and witnessed. Have we done all that we can to live up to the legacy of those before us? Have we cast aside partisan fears and put others above ourselves and our own self-preservation and put the people of the Commonwealth first? Or will our legacy be that of name-calling, partisan gamesmanship, and failure to adhere to data, facts, and science? Ultimately, our legacies here are linked to the policies that we pass and the actions that we take to ensure those in power represent the diversity of this Commonwealth. And the legacy of the governor and this legislative body will reflect bold, critical change. We've expanded Medicaid access. We're continuing to unwind vestiges of Jim Crow and mass incarceration in our deeply flawed justice system. We've ended the death penalty and so much more. Like Mrs. Butts, we didn't settle. We pushed more for change because we know the urgency of the problems we seek to fix. It's easy to lose sight of these things because we are often myopic and see what's immediately in front of us. Whether elected or unelected, we'll all leave a legacy. But like Mrs. Butts, we must all see broadly, create a Virginia that embodies the values of ideals of justice and equity and inclusion. Legacies loom large and impact what future generations choose to remember and celebrate. Let's not miss our chance to create one worthy of that challenge. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Delegate Jones.